come to think of it, back in the days when I was traveling through the country of Israel, and not only that, I was deeply impressed by how energetic and how vibrant the energy from the younger generations, and I could tell younger generations in Israel, they were prospering and they were growing not only intellectually, but also, again, spiritually. But somehow when we got to the conversation between the countries of Israel and Palestine, it got so quiet. Because number one, it's so complicated. And number two, it seems that no one actually has a definite answer how to solve this almost improbable crisis at this moment. Of course, looking ahead, we're in the year of 2022, and this matter is still not going away. So that's why today I am so excited to talk to one expert, and her name is Dr. Einat Wilf, and she's the co-author of the book entitled The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestine Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. And meanwhile, she's a leading thinker on matters of foreign policy, economics, education. She was a member of the Israeli parliament from 2010 to 2013, where she served as a chair of the Education Committee and member of the influential Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. So, Dr. Wilf, welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Dr. Wilf, again, let's get to the question right away. As I mentioned in the intro, did I say it right? It seems as U.S. for decades has been very interested in helping those two nations, Israel and Palestine. But somehow, the more we try it, it gets worse. So in other words, this is the matter that it can never go away, but you can't say U.S. is not trying, but somehow the solution is just getting more disappointing than ever. Dr. Wilf, why?
So one of the things to understand in foreign policy, especially in the West, is I think we have a vast gap between the idea of doing good and the idea of feeling good. I think a lot of foreign policy is motivated by the desire to feel good. And certain things feel good: dialogue, negotiations, mutual understanding, help, financial assistance. But sometimes these things, even though they feel good to those who do them, they don't do good. And sometimes doing good requires doing unpleasant things that certain policymakers do not want to do. And what are some of these unpleasant things that need to happen in order to end the conflict? To fundamentally understand what the conflict is about, it's actually remarkably simple. It's not complicated. The conflict is between the Jewish desire to have a state in the region, in any borders, and between the Arab and especially Palestinian rejection of that Jewish desire in any borders. This was actually well phrased by a British foreign minister, Ernst Bevin, after World War II. He basically defined the conflict as follows. He says, in the land, the Jews want a state, and the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. It's important to understand this because this is not like two peoples or two nations fighting over borders. And the question is, okay, should we move the border from here to there? This is basically one nation saying, we want to govern ourselves in this land. We'll take even a part of it. And the other people in the land saying, absolutely not. They get nothing. This is why the conflict is so difficult to resolve, because these are by definition mutually exclusive goals. And even just the sentence that I said now, nobody likes to hear that. You want to hear about zone of mutual agreement and negotiations.
That's right.
You don't want someone to come to say these are mutually exclusive goals, which by the way means that the conflict can only end when one side basically gives up on trying to achieve its goal. And this is the reason the conflict has lasted for more than a century, because for over a century, we're stuck in what I call this a battle of mutual exhaustion. Each side is trying to get the other side, or to exhaust the other side, into giving up on their goal. The Arabs are trying to exhaust the Jews by wars and terrorism and international condemnations to give up on their desire to have a state. And the Jews are trying to exhaust the Arabs, mostly by standing firm, to give up on their desire to throw us out or to prevent us from having a state. Basically, to get them to finally just let us be. Now, when you look at outside actors like the United States, when they try to bring the sides to negotiate, but fundamentally we still have two mutually exclusive goals, this is going to explode again and again and again because there's nothing to agree on. So the way to actually get to an agreement is to get the Arab side, the Palestinians, to give up on their desire that Israel will no longer exist and that the Jews will not govern themselves. Now, that's not a pleasant message because it's a message of defeat. And nobody likes to talk about it, right? I talked about dialogue, mutual understanding. Nobody likes to talk about victory and defeat anymore, right? That was good for World War II, and we don't talk about it anymore. But if the goal of the Palestinian Arabs, and for a very long while of the entire Arab world, that the Jews will not have a state in any part of the land, and to that end, they have gone to multiple wars and terrorism and international condemnations, it is not until they accept defeat in that goal that we can move on. Only when they say, look, we understand that the Jewish people have the right to govern themselves, what we call the right to self-determination. And now that we accept this right, we want to discuss border arrangements. That is going to be one of the easiest and fastest negotiations when we get to that point. What's taking so long is that mutual exhaustion is right now, no one's willing to give up. The Jews don't want to give up on their right to self-determination.
That's right.
And the Palestinian Arabs don't want to give up on their goal that the Jews no longer govern themselves. So we're stuck.
Dr. Wilf, if we can trace back from this history, and not too long, and we know that during previously under Trump administration, one of the presidential activities that President Trump did, which I believe we could say shocked the entire world, is to acknowledge that Jerusalem, was the official capital of Israel, and given the fact that moved the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And I think that was completely surprised to the international community. And of course, domestically and internationally speaking, for Christians, for evangelical community, that was such a milestone, and that was something that this evangelical community had been looking forward to or been praying for decades. Of course, by doing that immediately caused a firestorm on the other side. So Dr. Wilf, coming to you is, from your perspective, that would you think that President Trump did something good during his presidency despite all the negativity? And why would you think it's so terrifying or even scary for the other side?
So when it comes to his policy in the Middle East, President Trump pretty much got it perfectly right. And I think as a result, he also reaped what he sowed in the form of the Abraham Accords, the fact that this was relatively very quiet time in the Middle East, precisely because he was willing to break with decades of Western orthodoxy about how to solve the conflict and who you need to coddle. He understood very clearly that, the Palestinians and the Arab world for so long have been indulged. And this is why we use the word in the name of our book. The Palestinians and the Arabs were indulged in their rejectionism. They kept on saying no to Israel. And the West was like, let's talk some more. Let's talk some more. rather than saying, if this is going to be no, then we're just moving on. We're not going to wait for you forever. And I think that was a very powerful message that came from the Trump administration in the Middle East, which is, we're moving on. We're not letting you veto this situation forever. One of the ways of moving on was taking the very obvious decision of finally acknowledging that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. And he also did it wisely, which is, he said, this doesn't mean that Jerusalem's current municipal boundaries, which personally I think are horrendous. I grew up in Jerusalem. Jerusalem needs to be a much smaller city. But he said that the current municipal boundaries of Jerusalem can be negotiated. So he said, I'm not acknowledging every square meter of Jerusalem's current municipal boundaries, but Jerusalem is Israel's capital. And what they found out that, yes, some people muttered, and on the day there were some demonstrations, but not about the capital, more about the desire to have no Jewish state, what were called the marches of return in Gaza. But at the end of the day, all the intelligence communities and so-called experts who said the Middle East is going to, break out in a great storm of fire, no, nothing happened, and people moved on.
Dr. Wilf, I want to ask you if you can describe, again, what motivated you and to co-author this book, because, again, at the beginning when I was to look at the title of the book, and how Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream has completely debauched the path to peace. And we know that today, from this foreign policy side, the word peace is so critical. And of course, it's almost impossible to achieve given this condition. But now, how feasible or how realistic we are speaking that to maintain this peace at this moment? And if we can do that, what is the alternative at least we could do to minimize the threat between those two countries?
So I call myself a long-term optimist. I think, and we look at the history, we've seen people change and change their goals, and nations accept a changing reality. So I think if the West were finally ready to stop indulging the Palestinians and to tell them, your goal since the first half of the 20th century of no Jewish state and any borders whatsoever has not been achieved and will not be achieved. You've been defeated in that war and you need to move on. We're happy to support you if you want to live next to Israel, but we're not going to support you if your goal remains to be instead of Israel, which is the present situation. I think if the West persisted in that and continued with the Abraham Accords and the agreements with the Arab nations, basically signaling to the Palestinians, you no longer have the world's backing, and not even the Arab world's backing, to keep saying no, 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 you might begin to see over time, I'm not saying it will happen tomorrow morning, but in the course of a generation, groups and leaders who will say, perhaps it's time to say yes. So I do believe that's possible, but we're not going to get there by closing our eyes. We're not going to get there by continuing to indulge the Palestinians in their worldview that Israel is an illegitimate country that should not exist. It would be great if, as you said, this were a conflict between two countries, like Palestine and Israel. The problem is that Palestinians like to think of Palestine as a country when it's useful against Israel, such as in UN condemnations. But they hate to think of themselves as a country when it means assuming proper responsibility for historic events and for the present. So if Palestine were a country, it would make no sense for 2.2 million people who live in Palestine, in the West Bank and Gaza, to keep calling themselves refugees from Palestine, which is what they call themselves now, waiting that day when finally Israel disappears and they can take it all. So they play with this notion of being a country and not being a country, so-called Schrodinger's Palestine, only when it's useful against Israel.
Dr. Wilf, we know the year of 2022, it's so critical for America, especially for the Democrats. Not only they're facing this midterm election, but, I hate to be this naysayer, but foreign policy under this current administration has not been one of the priorities on the table, or it may not be even that matter at this moment, given this domestic mess. Now, from your perspective, compared with the previous administration, why do you think right now, under the current administration of Joe Biden, in terms of dealing with or finding this mutual peace or this mutual harmony for the Middle Eastern countries has not taken place? Why do you think it's so the delay for that?
I was wondering about that myself, because you had an administration that literally had it was to pick up from the floor.
Right.
Arab countries who have become exhausted from the conflict, who understand that opposing Israel was just a waste of resources and time, and that literally nothing good came to the Arab world from making hatred of Israel and the desire to eliminate it the centerpiece of their ideology. I mean, you cannot think of one good thing that came to the Arab world from devoting so many resources to that purpose. So you finally have Arab countries who are saying enough is enough. We want to build a successful, prosperous future for the Middle East, and normalizing relations with Israel is part of it. And this started especially under President Trump. I don't know if it's this juvenile idea that, if Trump did it, then we're not going to do it. But it took a really long time for the Biden administration to finally embrace the Abraham Accords. And even now, when they finally embraced them, they're not really putting their thumb on the scale in the same way that the Trump administration did in order to make it happen. But I will say this: it's better for the Middle East if they don't intervene than if they intervene badly. So it's great if they can do the right thing, but if they can't do the right thing, at least if they do nothing, that's okay too.